In the early months of 1813, Napoleon Bonaparte still appeared unstoppable. French armies dominated much of Europe. Kingdoms had been dismantled, borders redrawn, treaties imposed at sword point. From the outside, the empire looked intact, powerful, disciplined, victorious. But beneath the thunder of artillery and the spectacle of marching columns, a different conflict was unfolding far from the battlefield. Not in Paris, not in Vienna. But in London, inside counting houses, banks, and government offices where no uniforms were worn and no shots were fired. This is the story of how finance, not force, determined the outcome of Europe's greatest war. By the time Napoleon marched into Russia in 1812, his ambitions had reached their peak. The Grand Armée numbered more than 600,000 men, a concentration of military power unmatched in modern European history. But the campaign exposed a fatal weakness. Logistics collapsed, supply lines broke. Winter finished what strategy could not, the army returned shattered. Yet even after that catastrophe, Napoleon's war machine continued to function. Armies still needed to be fed, paid, clothed, and armed. Officers demanded salaries, horses required fodder, cannons consumed powder. War at that scale was not just fought with men, it was sustained with money. And by 1813, France was running out of it. Earlier victories had funded themselves. Conquered territories were looted, war indemnities were imposed, resources were seized, but expansion had limits. The faster Napoleon conquered, the harder it became to extract reliable revenue from newly occupied lands. Military success no longer translated cleanly into cash. Across the English Channel, Britain faced a different strategic reality. It could not dominate Europe with land armies. It could not match Napoleon man for man on the continent. But Britain controlled the seas, protected its homeland, and most importantly, possessed something France lacked entirely: a financial system that worked. British industry produced weapons, uniforms, and supplies at scale. Trade continued despite war, but the true advantage lay deeper inside the machinery of credit. Britain had built a reputation for honoring its debts. Investors trusted the government, and that trust unlocked vast sums of capital. Where France struggled to borrow, Britain borrowed relentlessly. The British state financed its war through bonds underwritten by the Bank of England and the City of London. By 1813, national debt had exploded to staggering levels, more than £600 million, well over twice Britain's annual economic output. On paper, it was a terrifying number. In practice, it barely mattered. Confidence held. Investors continued to lend. The government continued to spend. Fleets sailed, factories ran, armies moved, but money, unlike promises, must travel. Credit might be written on paper, but soldiers could not eat paper. They required hard payment. And in this era, payment meant gold. Physical, minted bullion, heavy, slow, vulnerable, crossing seas and borders under guard. Britain's war finance depended on this flow of gold. And Britain didn't just fund itself, it financed everyone else. Prussia, Russia, Austria, Britain's continental allies, lacked the financial infrastructure to sustain prolonged war against France. Their governments could raise men but not money. Without external support, their armies would have collapsed under their own costs. British gold kept them alive. These subsidies were not charity, they were calculated strategy. Britain paid allies to keep pressure on Napoleon, knowing that every French regiment tied down on the continent was one less threat to British security. By 1813, British payments supported tens of thousands of Allied troops. Entire armies marched on London's credit. At this point, central banking was still evolving. The Bank of England was not yet the modern institution we recognize today. But it functioned as the heart of British war finance, issuing notes, managing government borrowing, and stabilizing markets. Gold convertibility had already been suspended decades earlier. Banknotes were no longer guaranteed immediate redemption in specie. This allowed Britain to expand its money supply aggressively. It was risky. Inflation was a real danger, but in wartime, survival outweighed orthodoxy. And Britain understood something Napoleon never fully grasped. War is not won by avoiding debt, it is won by managing it better than your enemy. In June 1813, at Reichenbach, Britain formalized this strategy. Massive subsidies were promised to Prussia, some so large they exceeded what Britain could field in soldiers of its own. Austria and Russia agreed to commit forces only after British payments were guaranteed not once but continuously. Battles were now being scheduled by account. Napoleon, for all his brilliance, never built a comparable system. France relied on conscription, requisition, and forced contributions. These methods extracted resources quickly but destroyed trust. They could not mobilize private capital at scale. French debt instruments failed to inspire confidence. Borrowing was expensive, limited, and unreliable. Britain, by contrast, transformed debt into a weapon. Wealthy elites and merchants willingly financed the war, purchasing bonds that paid steady interest and were backed by a government with a proven record of repayment. Capital flowed not because Britain was richer, but because it was trusted. As Allied armies advanced in 1814, their cohesion depended less on battlefield genius than on cash delivery. Paymasters followed troops with gold. Soldiers fought because they were paid. Commanders maneuvered based on budgets as much as strategy. Money didn't just support operations, it dictated them. We remember Waterloo as a dramatic clash between Napoleon and Wellington. Muskets fired, cannons roared, cavalry charged. But long before the first shot was fired, the outcome had already been shaped. Wellington could march because his army was funded. His allies stood firm because their governments were solvent. Napoleon's strategy unraveled not just from military pressure, but from financial exhaustion. By 1815, Britain's debt was enormous, unprecedented in scale. Yet the state survived, bonds continued to sell, confidence endured, France emerged broken, its army decimated, its economy strained, its financial system weakened beyond recovery. In the centuries that followed, historians would marvel at how a nation of merchants and bankers had defeated Europe's greatest general. Waterloo, they would conclude, was not only a battle of steel and smoke, it was a battle of ledgers. History remembers the generals, but sometimes it is the financiers who decide how wars end.